Welcome to a moderated discussion with Laila Assange of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas and Dr. Rusell Green of Rice University's Baker Institute. My name is Ismaili Noormohmad, and I am your MC for today's event. I am the founder and CEO of a multi-service accounting firm, and I also currently serve as the chairman for the Aga Khan Economic Planning Board for the Southwestern United States. Today's program is entitled The Local and Global Economic Trends in a Post-Pandemic World, and is proudly presented to you by the Ismaili Jamaatkhana and Center. Through the guidance of His Highness the Aga Khan, the 49th hereditary Imam of the Shia Ismaili Muslims, the Ismaili Jamaatkanas in the United States are positioned to be more than places of worship and spiritual search. There are places of friendship, dialogue, and inclusivity, reaching out to neighbors to facilitate an exchange of ideas. This is achieved through hosting cultural programs such as educational seminars and lectures, art exhibitions, music and dance, and as a forum for civic leaders and others. At the opening ceremony of the new headquarters of the Global Center for Pluralism on May 16, 2017, the Aga Khan explained, and I quote, "Pluralism does not mean the elimination of difference, but the embrace of difference. Genuine pluralism understands that diversity does not weaken a society, it strengthens it. In an ever-shrinking, ever more diverse world, a genuine sense of pluralism is the indispensable foundation for human peace and progress." End quote. These spaces hope to encourage community engagement and collaboration on issues of concern, as well as broadening intellectual horizons. Today is no exception, as we seek insights from our esteemed guest. Laila Assange is a senior business economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. As a member of the research department's regional group, she conducts research on regional economic issues, produces articles for various bank publications, and contributes to a Dallas Fed's website. Her other responsibilities include briefing the bank's president on regional economic conditions, coordinating the production of various economic updates and indicators for the Dallas Fed website, and writing the 11th District Beige Book, the bank's survey of regional economic conditions. We are also joined by Dr. Rusell Green, who previously held the position of Will Clinton Fellow for International Economics at the Baker Institute. Dr. Green also spent 4 years in India as the U.S. Treasury Department's first financial attaché to that country. He has also served as the Deputy Director of the U.S. Treasury's Office of International Monetary Policy, where he led efforts to strengthen International Monetary Fund exchange rate policies and international reserve management. Today's discussion will be moderated by Inayat Noormohmad, President and founder of an energy solutions company and the former Director and Chief Economist for the Kansas Department of Labor. Without further ado, please enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's a pleasure and an honor to have two of our panelists today discussing with us the local and the global economic trends post-pandemic. We have Dr. Rusell Green and Laila Assange joining us today. Thank you to both of you for giving us the time and the insights in what is to be a very exciting conversation. So thank you both for joining us today. Let me first start with the question which a lot of our young and up-and-coming professionals are probably thinking about is, tell us a little bit about how your educational and career trajectory landed you in your current positions that you're in today. Laila?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation today with both you and Inayat as well as Rusell. Before I begin, just a quick disclaimer that my views are my own and they do not represent those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas or the Federal Reserve System. So for me, my kind of journey goes all the way back. I was actually born and raised in Pakistan, and then I came to the US. I went to school here. I have my undergraduate degree from Northwestern in Chicago, which was in economics. And then I went on to do my master's in economics and finance from the London School of Economics. And right after I graduated, I came back straight to the US and I started working at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and I have been with them since then.
Fantastic. Thank you. Rusell?
Yeah, and Inayat, I have to say thank you as well. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I should also give a disclaimer that my views do not necessarily represent those of the Baker Institute for Public Policy or the International Monetary Fund. Yeah, you know, I think similarly, I'd have to go way back. Even in high school in Houston, I wanted to do policy economics and macroeconomics. So you know, it was a long time that I've wanted to do what I was finally able to do. I went to college out on the West Coast, Pomona College, was an economics major. Then I went actually to the Fed, so I've got a Fed connection myself. I was a research assistant there. Got a PhD in economics, and then the rest is history. I worked at the U.S. Treasury, and then went to Rice, and now I'm at the International Monetary Fund.
Certainly an exciting and an amazing career path that you guys have. So it's indeed, again, an honor and a pleasure to have you. So let's dive in, if you will. So I know this is a lot of in the forefront of a lot of folks right now, which is the post-pandemic world, hopefully post-pandemic in the true sense that we're living in. There has been a lot of stimulus that has been kind of pumped into our economy, at least in the US sense. What do you think are some of the short-term and the medium-term outcomes through those, what I call the booster shots into the economy, Rusell?
Yeah, well, you know, I think one of the things that's really somewhat unprecedented with this American Recovery Act and the stimulus is that it really is a short-term measure. I mean, I don't know if we've pumped so much money into the economy in such a short time ever before, but that for sure is going to provide propulsion to the economy in the near term. I think that it's likely to, it's likely to boost GDP considerably, and not just in the U.S., but really have a global impact as well. That's gonna play out in unemployment, and I think everybody is wondering what's going to happen with inflation as well. And I think most of the models are showing that we may have a short-term increase, but the medium-term impact is likely to be much smaller on the inflation side. But I think the real question here is more kind of the medium-term impact. Is this really just a recovery mechanism to get us back to where we were before the pandemic, or are we on a higher trajectory? And my guess is that this is mostly just getting us back to where we might have been.
So, Laila, when you look at the stimulus, and a lot of that has been at the national front, how do you see this trickling down to the local economies and impacting the small and medium-sized businesses? And what are some of your data points that you sort of track at the Federal Reserve level are sort of telling us about the recovery efforts and the impact of it on those sort of sides of the businesses?
So I think first of all, start and say the fact that the stimulus that was pumped into the economy was actually necessary. Like Rusell was saying, yes, we've pumped a lot of money into the economy, but we needed it. And we needed it because this recession was different. It was a pandemic-led recession. And had that money not been pumped into the market, we certainly would not be at this point in the recovery. So certainly we would have seen more job losses. We would have seen more small businesses go under. We would have seen perhaps more pain in the financial markets, which reversed quite quickly last spring. So, with that said, it doesn't take away from, any of the job losses that we've seen, any of the pain or suffering that has happened in this past year. And the effects have been felt locally as well. I mean, Texas obviously has benefited from all of the money that has been pumped into the economy. Certainly, Texas's trajectory has been slightly different from what the U.S. has taken over the past year, in the sense that the job losses, and the contraction in GDP was not as sharp in Texas relative to what we saw for the nation, which was obviously a good thing for Texas overall. So because the hole was not as steep to fill, the recovery has also been a little bit better. So right now, for Texas, we are seeing a little bit more optimism in the economy, perhaps, and that's true. Though that's true for the U.S. as well. I think businesses in Texas are a little bit more optimistic, and we've also certainly seen a turnaround in the energy sector, which for Texas is a much bigger deal than it is for the U.S. because we are the #1 oil and gas producer in the nation. So as go oil prices, so does the Texas economy, and so that has also been a benefit for us. In terms of, sort of looking at where we stand and where we go from here, like Rusell said, a lot of the forecasts are very optimistic about the US economy this year. A lot of them point to north of 6% GDP growth for the US. That certainly will translate into good growth for Texas as well. As far as employment goes and labor markets are concerned, the expectation is that the US hopefully will be back to its pre-pandemic employment levels by sometime next year. And because like I said, the hole for Texas was a little bit less to fill compared to the job losses we saw nationally, the hope and our sort of estimate is that hopefully by the end of this year, we will see a recovery in Texas employment. So our employment levels are back to where they were pre-pandemic.
Yeah, and then I think that's fantastic to hear the optimism that has been sort of shown in a lot of the forecast, as well as the policy decisions that are being sort of considered. Now let's unpack the responses that you just gave. And I wanted to maybe go back late February or early March of last year, when things were starting to shut down, and what we were expecting, like the doom and gloom situation in terms of the impact of it across the board in the economy. And as we sort of fast forward to where we are today, what is interesting, at least in some of the data that I've seen, is that there are some industries, some sectors of the economy which actually did quite well. And there are some sectors and industries which were perhaps not prepared or did not do well. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the winners and losers in this process, and how do you see those that have won moving forward as compared to those that sort of did not do that well during the pandemic move forward? Laila?
And generally talk about what economic recession looks like. So typically when there is an economic recession, in the past several ones, we've seen that the goods sector, and that's the sector which consists of manufacturing, construction, and energy industries, is the first to be impacted. Services usually gets impacted much, much later in a typical recession. Now, this past recession was not typical. It was very different than what we saw during the great financial crisis, when housing went under, and then a lot of the other sectors followed, and we had a full-blown recession. And this time around, it appeared that the services sector, obviously, which is a huge part of US GDP, it makes up about 80% of US GDP, was simultaneously hit by the recession, as was the goods sector. And then no economic sector was spared by the pandemic. So initially, when the shutdowns were instituted and we all had to stay home and businesses were closed, pretty much every sector of the economy was hit by the pandemic. By those closures, it was a big blow to especially the service industries. And within service industries, sectors where you see person-to-person contact is really high, such as restaurants, hotels, our entertainment venues, our hair salons. They were the hardest hit. And they have also been the slowest to recover. Again, that has to do with the nature of the pandemic, which requires us to limit our mobility, to maintain physical distance. And so we've seen demand for some of those services come back, but not to the same degree as we have seen in other parts of the service economy. Now, the good news is that we are seeing restaurants beginning to bounce back. They likely are coming ahead of the bounce back that we will eventually see in the hotel and entertainment industry. But barring no setback on the COVID front, we expect continued growth in these areas. And then I also feel that once things start to normalize a little bit, we will see a pickup in leisure travel, and that will also lead to increased demand for both gasoline, and perhaps it might even lead to some higher prices at the pump. In terms of the sectors, now on the flip side, there are certain sectors which, as you alluded to, did benefit from the pandemic. The first one, which is a big one, was the housing market. It has been really hot since I would say May of last year. Once those shelter-in-place orders were lifted, we've seen record sales, we've seen very tight inventories, rapidly rising prices. And likely we'll see some, moderate growth in that sector in the medium term if low mortgage rates persist and we continue to see the job market recover. Now, there are some other sectors which have also benefited from the pandemic. One of them has been warehousing and storage. We've seen the financial services industry surprisingly do really well. Some of that has to do with the PPP loan program, stronger demand for mortgages. And so in these sectors, employment currently is either at or in fact above pre-pandemic levels. So they've actually seen a full recovery in terms of the labor market. Another sector which has benefited has been online retailing, because a lot of us have had to shift away from shopping in person versus going online. So we've seen a big boom in that as well. And that, I think, and I'm just now kind of taking the picture back and looking at things locally. I think that has been a benefit for Texas because of its central location and proximity to Mexico, and also having a big port down in Houston and in Corpus Christi. I think those certainly are things that would benefit us in the future as well.
Great.
Go ahead.
No, please.
And another thing I wanted to mention is that we've also seen a lot of technological innovation in this pandemic. Some of those trends were in place before the pandemic, in fact, happened, but they got accelerated. So a lot of companies have adopted technology. And so I feel a lot of those will stick with us going forward. The online sales, the contactless delivery, the virtual platforms for schooling and conferences. And so even when we return back to normal, and the normal will be different, we will see a perpetuation of those forces into the future.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that comprehensive sort of outlook on that. So just maybe zooming out, Rusell, looking at this from maybe not a sectoral view, but perhaps a world view. How do you see this sort of the evolution of the pandemic crisis? How has it been handled worldwide, particularly the developing countries? And I know India is your expertise. How have they fared? And then how does it matter that different countries have different trajectories, or will it impact us here nationally that different countries are coming out of it at a different sort of trajectory and different pace than ours? And then we also hear about the current lockdowns that are going on in some parts of the world as we speak. How do you see that impacting us as well?
Yeah, well, I guess there's a lot to say there, but what I would say first is that we've certainly seen that it's the advanced economies who've been leading the recovery so far, and with the United States ahead of just about everybody else, besides perhaps China. China having already gotten its economy back to pre-pandemic levels, and the U.S. now coming back. And I think a lot of the reason why the advanced economies have been able to come back stronger is two things. First is the fiscal policy. That is, that the advanced economies had a lot more space and capacity to expand their fiscal put into place fiscal stimulus packages like we did in the United States. Not everybody did something quite as dramatic as we did, but certainly, other countries, Japan in particular, and the UK have had very strong fiscal responses. The second thing is of course the vaccines. Advanced economies are making more progress on average than other countries are in terms of vaccinating their populations, and this will allow life to return and economic activity to return to normal sooner than others. So, I think the IMF is forecasting that whereas the sort of year or 2 years, or I should say maybe from the start of the pandemic out to 2024, the total lost GDP for advanced economies may wind up being somewhere in the ballpark of 2 to 3%. For emerging markets and low-income countries, we're looking at something more like 6% loss of GDP. So there's a significant divergence. When I say emerging market countries, I should say that's excluding China, which has had a very different experience. So you've got advanced economies that have done okay and are kind of on a trajectory out. Among the emerging market countries, you certainly have countries that are on the fast way out. India in particular, I think, is expected to grow really quite rapidly this year. But even by the end of next year, its sort of forecast GDP is expected to be below what we had hoped it to be before the pandemic. So in terms of getting all the way back to where they were, I think we're much more likely to see that kind of progress, that kind of achievement in the advanced economies.
Great, thank you. Now, both of you touched on this topic, and I wanted to sort of draw a little bit more attention to that. Is the environment in terms of the fiscal stimulus, the monetary stimulus, and also the rising asset prices and commodity prices, and then the environment that creates, which kind of worries a lot of folks in terms of investments and also in terms of savings, which is inflation and how prices will affect the future sort of growth in overall GDP terms. How do you see this playing out in the medium term, and then how do you think that impacts, let's say, the average person, an average household in the U.S.?
Should I?
Please go ahead, Rusell.
So I think the expectation is, and I don't see any reason why to expect differently myself, but the markets seem to be expecting that inflation is not necessarily going to become a big problem, that the central bank largely has the tools that it needs to keep it under control. Really, the question is, what is the policy, the interest rate path that's going to be necessary to follow in order to keep inflation under control? And I think markets are currently pricing in interest rates coming off the bottom sometime next year, and then rising slowly with policy rates, going up, into the sort of 2-3% range. I think even at some point. So I think without a doubt, asset prices right now have been boosted by the fact that interest rates are really low. It's just the way pricing works. So the fact that interest rates have been so low and expected to stay low certainly has supported a lot of asset price growth. And so the real problem with forecasts, sort of worrying too much about asset prices, is that currently markets are already pricing in to a large degree their expectations of the future. So basically, markets have this expectation of what's going to happen with Fed policy based on everything we know today. People are putting their money on the line. These are good bets, and so the expectations for interest rates are there and visible in the market. And so to a large degree, that should also be incorporated into asset prices. So I wouldn't necessarily think that, given what we know today, we would expect to see big movement in asset prices based on anything other than surprises, and surprises by definition are impossible to predict. So that's a very good, safe economist answer to say, I don't know what's going to happen next.
Indeed it is. But I think some of the fundamentals that are at play here, I think I completely sort of agree with you. Is it's kind of priced into the model, the way the assets are priced, and the future outlook is kind of based on that. Now, I wanted to sort of perhaps talk about topics which is a little bit near and dear to my heart, and then Laila, you kind of alluded to that, which is the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate has been improving quite a bit. However, we're still kind of a little bit away from the pre-pandemic levels, and what is more concerning is perhaps the divergence in unemployment rates between certain subgroups, and particularly minority groups, which perhaps is also sort of a prelude to some of the larger issues that we've seen over the past several years, the inequality in terms of income and wealth, whether it's gender or whether it's with minority groups. If you can maybe shed some light as to how did we get to this point where there's such a large amount of income inequality, which is considered a risk perhaps to the social fabric within which we live, and then how do we navigate ourselves out of that, and what are some of the structural issues that we ought to be looking at?
And certainly have been at the forefront recently, but these are long-term issues, and I think it is going to take time to course correct them. It's not something that can happen overnight. The issue is that typically when a recession happens, we do see that people who are low income and those who are from communities of color tend to be harder hit. That was also certainly the case. This time around, we know that the unemployment rate amongst both Blacks and Hispanics is much higher than what the average is for the US. Also, those without a high school diploma or those with a high school diploma but without a college education are also facing higher unemployment rates. So that typically is, I guess for the last recession, we did see a lot of other sectors hit. Also, the higher skilled were hit, but the low skilled workers tend to always get hit a little bit harder than others when a downturn does occur. And this is just certainly true for the US. It's certainly true for the Texas. I don't think the trends are any different. But because these are long-term structural issues, I think the solution also has to be over the medium to the long term. We need to sort of invest more in, more in education, more in access to healthcare, access to broadband. A lot of the communities of color get left behind because they simply don't have, it's called the digital divide. They simply don't have access to, broadband internet. And so with everything being online these days, we've seen a lot of them suffer, especially school-age children because of that. And so the idea is that if we really want to prosper fully and make sure our recovery takes everybody along with us, we have to have a more inclusive economy, and particularly invest in those communities of color and in the low income workers, and upskill them so that they can fully participate and also benefit from the recovery as it happens. And as we get back perhaps to our potential, which hopefully we will hit sometime next year, they can also fully participate in the economy.
Very well, which leads to very well to the $2 trillion or so infrastructure plan that has been proposed by the current administration. So Rusell, I know it's a $2 trillion spent over maybe 4, 5, 8 years. I believe that's 8 years is the year that they're thinking, number of years. How do you first of all do you think that there's those sort of plans which sort of add to the sort of build the infrastructure, maybe including broadband, which is the new road and highway for the modern economy? How do you see that play out, and how do you see that addressing some of these income and wealth gap that we're seeing amongst different groups of societies within our country?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I probably should first go back to this initial stimulus plan. Our $1.9 trillion plan that's already been enacted, which really much more than plans in the past focuses really on the population that most needs it, in the sense that it's it's going to flow more to folks with lower incomes, and so it's much more progressive in that sense. So that initially will help. I think there are estimates. I don't want to quote one in particular, but like childhood poverty will be dramatically impacted over the next year or two by this. By that plan alone, as we go thinking about the infrastructure package, which of course hasn't been passed, so we can't say exactly what it's going to be like. Without a doubt, there will be major construction projects and elements of this which are providing jobs for middle income, lower income, say less educated segments of the population, and that should help to the extent that it lasts over a period of, let's say, 8 years. Just the output of it will likely be skewed a bit more towards providing jobs for folks with less education. Although, as you mentioned, there is a substantial component of the plan as it stands, which would go more towards kind of high-tech type stuff like, digital economy, innovation, research and development. And then, there's also an element that is likely to go towards jobs and training, which should again, ideally be focused towards folks who may be kind of lower on the education scale to begin with. The issue with that we face, though, is really a longer term, really secular trend that capital that is providing machinery and computers and things has been getting cheaper and cheaper every year for 50, 60 years. And at the same time, our educational attainment has not necessarily kept up so that everybody is able to participate in more sophisticated sectors of the economy. And so we have what, as economists, we call skill biased wage premium, meaning that folks are really reaping the benefits more when they have higher levels of education. And given the pace of technology, as Laila rightly pointed out earlier, the pandemic has only accelerated the adoption of technology that leads to automation and greater digitization. That really, those are trends that are going to be only cause greater skill bias. And so, as Laila mentioned, I think a focus on training and education is going to be really critical. And this is something that goes way beyond the U.S. These are problems that are being faced in almost every country, both advanced economies and emerging markets. The fact that lower skilled labor is just easier to automate, cheaper to automate, and we have a big worldwide pool of labor that we now have access to at that level.
Wow, that's fantastic. It seems like all signs are pointing towards how well we equip ourselves in terms of skills and knowledge to not only address the skills gap with what is needed, but also perhaps the wealth gap and the income gap between these different segments of the population. Thank you so much for shedding the light on that. Laila, I'm going to ask you a little bit about what we've been hearing in the news, again, in the same vein of addressing some of the income gaps. Is there a lot of cities and a lot of, maybe, I'm not sure if countries have experimented with this, but there's something called the universal basic income. And I've read quite a few studies in that, and I'm always amazed to see some of the results. And what do you see in terms of the long-term viability of something like that in bridging this gap and sort of taking along everyone who's not been so perhaps been able to take benefit of the overall economy? And how do you see this maybe moving forward, if at all, at a larger scale?
So, I'll start first saying that there's always two sides to a coin. And so while the idea does sound really great that you have this universal basic income, but it's really difficult to figure out exactly what the long-term impacts would be on the economy, especially if you kind of look at the US and if you look at local, populations. I just feel there are a lot more questions and then there are answers to this puzzle, and that's because it's, first of all, the cost of living is so different in different parts of the US. So, what if your dollar goes a lot further in Texas than it would in California or New York? All right, so if you set the basic income, is it the same across the states, or is it kind of based on your purchasing power parity? And if so, if it's based on purchasing power parity, and if it's different, then how does that change the dynamics of the labor force? And what does it do to our migration patterns? And what does it do to the demographics of these different parts of the country? We already have seen sort of a movement away from highly densely populated, high income areas towards sort of more spread out and lower cost of living portions of the US. And we've seen those migration trends keep up and not change much. In fact, accelerate to some degree in the pandemic. We've seen lots of people moving out, from the big cities to the suburbs. We've seen them move out of California and New York, for example, move to Texas. And so I think there are a lot more unanswered questions about this. And so it's difficult to say how this would kind of pan out in the future.
Fair enough. Rusell, conceptually, what are your thoughts about a program like this? I know internationally there have been some cities and municipalities that have tried this particular program. So please, if you can share some thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there are some places that have tried. To my knowledge, there hasn't been anything that's been wide scale enough to really forecast what the impact would be in a something large like a U.S. state. I mean, even with Alaska having its sort of funny income oil royalty return policy. I don't have the name right, but it acts like a little bit of a universal basic income in the sense that the state pays out most years to residents. It's not quite structured in a way that you can make a direct comparison. There are some potentially positive outcomes to this in terms of, in theory, if somebody has a guaranteed backstop that they're going to get this money, then maybe they can take more risks. Maybe they can spend a couple of years, quit work, retool, and start up in a new sector. Maybe they can take a chance starting a new business that they know that if they fail, then at least they've got the basic income covered. At the same time, as Laila so rightly mentioned, everything, it's a two-sided coin. Like I like to say, if you were totally set for life and didn't need to work another day in your life, the best thing that you could do is to keep working. And I'm saying this not as an economist, but really just sort of thinking about human nature. That is, what makes us happy as people is having meaning in our life. And so if if the basic income is such that you say, okay, I'm just not going to work, then that's going to create lots of social problems. I mean, we already see this with the fantastic work on that's been done looking at, say, working class men in the Midwest and the sort of increase in mortality and illness that's associated with the decline in manufacturing jobs and when you have a system that doesn't encourage you to be an active participant in society, if you can just sort of retreat, then certainly everybody's suffering right now from the retreat that we've all had for the last year. So anyway, I guess the bottom line is I think that as Laila mentions, the jury's still out on this one.
Indeed, and I think you're right that there's not been a large enough experiment for us to sort of extrapolate the impact of even at a state level. So indeed, an interesting concept. Perhaps hopefully it gets tried out at a larger scale, and we all get to see the results and what it means.
That there's some consequences whenever we've talked so much so far in this conversation about the stimulus and all the money it's pumped and what has that done to inflation. what does that do to our debt levels for the US, right? So if you're paying these payments out, someone has to bear the cost of it. And so who ends up with that bag at the end, and who gets left without a chair if you're for that matter, if you're playing musical chairs? So you don't really know. I mean, there's a lot more, like Rusell was saying, the jury is still out on this, and we certainly don't know, what the dynamics around this would be and how it would play out over the long term.
Fantastic. That kind of leads me to very nicely to the next question. And you talked about debt, and we all know where the U.S. debt is going with a lot of money that is being sort of pumped into the economy. I wonder, Laila, if you can comment on the impact of that on the value of the dollar, and then how it would impact perhaps just someone at an average household level in terms of their savings, their retirement, their purchasing power parity, let's say looking at it in the medium and the long term.
Okay, so I'm going to stay away from commenting on the dollar. But in terms of just the overall impact, I think we've sort of, to start off with it, we've already seen the fact that our US debt to GDP ratio is the highest it's ever been in history. And that's because we've pumped rightfully a lot of money into the economy. And so that's what I was saying, that debt servicing has a cost to it. In terms of inflation and what it means, I would go back to what Rusell said earlier on. I think this was necessary to pump this money into the economy. It was supposed to be a band-aid and a short-term solution just to get us out of the hole that we had fallen into because of the pandemic. The idea is that it's going to be short-term, and we're going to wean off of this, both in terms of monetary policy as well as fiscal stimulus, once we are at a place where we feel the economy is back on track, and that stimulus is no longer needed. So hopefully the long-term impact on inflation is going to be pretty much muted. It's only in the short term when the forces are reversing. And we also had a lot of deflationary pressures on, especially on goods prices, and still so much certainly on services prices, because we had withdrawn from the economy. We weren't spending for about 6 to 8 weeks when we were in lockdowns. And then when we did get back, and we did see prices sort of reverse last year. And I know this is a little bit different and on a tangent, but some of the inflation in goods prices is it's because of the demand, because we've shifted away from consuming services to now consuming goods in the economy. And so whenever that shift happens, you would, with higher demand and supply being tight, you will see basic 101 in economics says you will see prices go up. And also a lot of the pricing pressure currently in the markets is because of supply chain disruptions that we are seeing throughout the world. So we've seen supplies of a lot of different materials, whether that be metals or fuel or agricultural commodities, certainly being tight. And that is also adding to some of these movements in prices that you are currently seeing. But once that subsides and once we are able to slowly return back to normal, I think the consumption will again shift away from goods towards services, and service prices have been depressed. And I think they will start reverting. Since our consumption will shift, we will see some upward momentum and perhaps stability in those prices, and we won't see as much goods inflation in the economy.
Fantastic. So, Rusell, given what Laila just sort of shed the light on, and the trade issues that we've seen over the past several years, in some cases, trade barriers really in terms of the global economy. How do you see the impact of this in terms of the emerging and the developing markets worldwide? And then sort of reversely, how will that impact us here locally?
Sorry, which is this when you say?
Well, the issue with the debt that we are seeing, the debt levels, and the borrowing that the government has done, sort of in conjunction with the trade barriers that have been sort of propped up, not just by us, but different countries around the world. And then it certainly has an impact more so on perhaps the developing and the emerging markets more so than perhaps the developed market. and how do you see that sort of panning out, and how will that impact the recovery of some of these countries, specifically countries like India?
Yeah. So, I guess I would first say that the impact of debt is probably more coming through from the spending that leads to the debt than the debt itself, is my guess. That, the spending by basic economic theory should generally cause an appreciation of a currency. Fiscal stimulus does this in general. And, I think a lot of people saw that this happened with, say, the original tax cuts under the Trump administration, where we had a big fiscal stimulus and the dollar appreciated, and then there was some frustration about the impact on the U.S. trade balances as our current account deficit has really increased recently. Now, in conjunction with that, of course, there's been lots of dynamics on trade policy, and that's created complications for lots of emerging market countries. The two primary adversaries, of course, the U.S. and China, but the U.S. has pushed against Europe and pushed against Vietnam and a lot of different places. So what we've seen in general is that trade barriers are on average rising. If you do it by, say, count of how many measures, you see a lot more measures tightening than loosening lately. I think without a doubt, as we think about like the recovery from the current global recession, a focus of policy on loosening trade barriers is one that's going to generally help emerging market countries that tend to be more export oriented. They tend to be more commodity producers. The types of goods that they're producing tend to be more in the manufacturing side than the services side in terms of their exports. An opening up of the global economy is definitely going to help them and provide more opportunities for them to pick up the pace on their own recovery. But what that means, I think for the U.S. is that we're going to be in the situation that we found ourselves many times over the last 70 years, really, since the 60s, of being the consumer of last resort, that the U.S. runs a large trade deficit, and that essentially provides consumption demand for the rest of the world. And it's almost mechanical. When you're the country that has the largest fiscal stimulus, your economy is growing faster. Ultimately, your consumers are going to be consuming more than others, consumers in other countries, and particularly if people in lockdown are in lockdown in emerging market countries. If the vaccine rollout is slower in lower income countries, those consumers are going to take longer to pick back up and jump back into kind of normal consumption behavior. So I would expect that trend, that we certainly saw in 2020 to continue.
Awesome. Thank you, Russell. Now, I know we are coming to our close in terms of the time that we have allocated. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this question, Russell. We have a lot of buzz going on around cryptocurrency that spans across the world, and a lot of ups and downs that we are seeing. A lot of official statements that are being made, whether they'll be accepted as a form of currency or not by the Federal Reserves or of the world. Where do you see this going in terms of the long term, and is this going to be something which will be viable as a international sort of currency?
So I think cryptocurrencies in general are, it's an interesting field. It's relatively still relatively new, despite being around now for a number of years. And central banks are, I think, still trying to wrap their heads around the role that they can play. Whether there's a useful role to central banks providing their own kind of, I guess it wouldn't be a cryptocurrency at that point, but a digital currency. My guess is that a lot of the reason why there's so much buzz is actually because a lot of the current cryptocurrencies are not actually used as currencies so much as they are speculative investment vehicles, and that the speculation around them has driven prices up and down in dramatic ways, and so people have made and lost fortunes And at the moment, I think they're more up than down. And so I think they get a lot of buzz in that sense. But I think in the short run, that kind of activity is largely more speculation than having, say, a solid business model that backs it. But I think this is an area where there's potential for not necessarily any one particular currency that I would single out, but for the field in general to eventually produce something that central banks may endorse and could become a useful useful product, a more mainstream product. But again, it's important to keep the differentiation between these currencies' role as a sort of a speculative investment vehicle versus their role with an actual business model behind it. That is, currency should have a store of value, which when your prices are going up and down, that doesn't quite handle. And they should be able to be used for transactions. And I don't personally use them, but my sense is that transaction costs are coming down, but that they're still it's still relatively more difficult to use cryptocurrency for transactions. And you certainly don't see things being priced in cryptocurrencies very often, I think in part because the price fluctuates so much. So its actual use as a currency, I think, is still, and of course, I'm generalizing across a very, a field with a lot of variety. Is there are stable coins and there's other things that aren't designed to fluctuate so much, and we'll see how it all shakes out. I would say there's potential, but again, a lot of the buzz is likely due to the people's the stars they get in their eyes when they hear that just somebody got lucky and made an investment that shot up.
Right. And so essentially, buyers beware, make sure you know what you're doing and how you're investing. Laila, any further thoughts on that?
I would just add to that we are moving towards a more digital economy. And so in a digital economy, there's obviously more room for growth on payments as well. This perhaps is a form of payment, and it's worth looking into and sort of studying more to see what becomes of it in the future.
Fantastic. I think, unfortunately, to my dismay, we are towards the end of our time. I would have loved to have this conversation for another 2 hours, but I want to, first of all, thank you both, our panelists, Dr. Rusell Green and Laila Assange, for joining us today, and all of you audience for joining across the globe. We want to thank you all for tuning in. And again, thank you, Rusell and Laila, for joining us. What a fantastic conversation. And look forward to sort of our future discussions. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Dr. Green and Laila, for truly insightful discussion. Having the opportunity to get your insight on economic trends in a post-pandemic world has been extremely valuable. On behalf of the Ismaili Jamaat Kanayan Center, we also want to thank each and every one of you, our participants that joined virtually from across the globe. We hope that you found the program to be as valuable as we did. To get more information about the Ismaili Jamaat Kanayan Center, please go to the.smiley in your web browser, or for more information on upcoming programming, please go to facebook.com/the-smiley-USA or tv.smiley. We look forward to sharing more programming with you. Thank you.